Hello, everyone. Just letting people join the webinar because it might take some time, technical problems, etc., etc. Okay, I'll slowly start introducing today's webinar. Hello and welcome to the Nursing and Midwifery in Crisis webinar. This is a Nursing Now Challenge webinar done in partnership with Jai Mental Health and Japigo. My name is João Salguilo. I'm a mental health nurse and a Nursing Now Challenge champion, and I'm also the founder of Jai Mental Health, a small UK-based NGO that works with nurses in South Asia. This is the third series of chats that we've been having on nursing and midwifery in crisis. And today we are, on one hand, examining the role of nurses and midwives in crisis situations around the world. And on the other, we are encouraging discussions about what kind of support is available to nurses and midwives with a particular focus on mental health and well-being. So what kind of support for nurses and midwives working in areas where natural disasters occur, what support is out there that focus specifically on the mental health and well-being of nurses. And today the webinar will be examining the role particularly around natural disasters. As you know from previous webinars, this is the third one. We have the umbrella term nursing and midwifery in crisis. The first webinar was an introduction to this series of sessions that we've been doing over the past few months. The second one focused on war and conflict. And today we're looking at natural disasters. This webinar will be done in English and will be simultaneously translated into French. I think we're going to have a slide just in a few seconds explaining how you can choose to listen either in English or in French. There's actually a button on the right-hand side that says interpretation on your screens, and you should be able to choose which language you want to listen to this webinar. It's really great to include French-speaking guests in our panel. This is something that I think Nursing Now would love to be able to continue doing over the next few webinars, so that we can include also non-English in these sessions. As always, we have a really great group of panelists joining us today. Our keynote speaker is Christopher Peskett, who's a nurse and also trustee for Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders. And then we'll hear from experiences of nurses and midwives practicing in areas where natural disasters occur or whose work is related to this sort of area. We have Katie Hufflink, who is the Executive Director of Alliance of Nurses for Healthy Environments. We have Yves Carmel Fanfan, who is the Vice President of the Nursing and Midwifery Association of Haiti. Also from Haiti, we've got Jeftani Mathurin, who's also a midwife. And then we have Stephen Powell, also registered nurse and Challenges Committee co-chair for the Americas Regional Hub. I will then invite all panelists to a group discussion that will look at mitigation and preparedness of how we can support nurses and midwives working in areas affected by natural disasters. After the panel discussion, we will be introduced or reintroduced, because we had health action training with us in the previous webinar. So we will reintroduce health action training, who will give us some examples of training that can be offered to nurses and midwives working in disaster affected areas. And this will be done by Pat Deeney, the CEO of Health Action Training, and Matt Jennings, who is the head of development and delivery of Health Action Training. Now, as on previous webinars, you can find out throughout our chat box how to sign to these free courses that Pat and Matt will tell us about. Also use the chat box to send us your questions send us your thoughts. We'll try to answer all the questions that you have throughout the webinar. If not, do write to us via email. We'd love to hear your stories, your views, your thoughts for this webinar, for future webinars. So please do keep in touch throughout and after the webinar. I read on the BBC this morning that the first foreign aid planes have arrived in Tonga, bearing much needed supplies for the Pacific nation, which was left devastated by a volcanic eruption that probably all of you heard, and that was followed by a subsequent tsunami this past Saturday. So I would like to say that our thoughts are with everyone in Tonga, including the health professionals living and working in the region. And natural disasters, as you know, are major adverse events that result from natural processes in the earth. And the scientific community has been able to show how a changing climate influences and aggravates natural disasters. And on this note, I would really like to invite Chris Pescott, our first guest and keynote speaker, to tell us about your experience, Chris. I believe that you have a vast experience of working in various emergency responses, including the 2010 floods in Pakistan. So it'd be great to hear about these and other moments that you would like to share with us, and the role that you and other nurses have had in such circumstances. So welcome, Chris, and the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Joanne, for the very pertinent words of your introduction. And hello to everybody out there in all your different time zones. I also like to thank Nursing Now Challenge for giving me the chance to speak today, for giving the keynote talk. I'm very honored to do this. I saw the other two webinars and I was really impressed by what I was seeing and what I was hearing. So really, I'm honored to be here with you all today. As Joanne said, I work for Médecins Sans Frontières, or in English, Doctors Without Borders, or to make it even more easy to say MSF. I'm very privileged to have worked for MSF for many years, to be involved in emergency humanitarian work. MSF, for the people there who do not know it, is an international non-governmental organization. And I should say at the very beginning that although we have doctors in the name, Doctors Without Borders, for every doctor in MSF, you'll find 10 nurses or midwives. We are really a nurse-led organization. If you're looking at nursing care on a day-to-day basis, caring for the patients, if you're looking at organizing the clinics or the hospitals or program management, nurses are taking key roles. And I'm seeing it increasingly in many non-governmental organizations. And let's face it, this is how it should be anyway. MSF, we work in 70 countries. We give medical care to the most vulnerable populations on this planet because of conflict, disease, and natural disaster caused by floods, droughts, hurricanes, earthquakes, and, as Joanne mentioned, volcanic eruptions. And I today am going to illustrate, as Joanne mentioned, my experience by talking about my time in Pakistan. In 2010, there was a major flood in Pakistan. Maybe we can see the first picture, Andrea. There were heavy rainfalls in the north of the country in the mountains, and that led to the major river, the Indus, overflowing. And as you can see a little bit from this map, 15 to 20% of the country of Pakistan was flooded. In the first few days, probably about 2,000 people lost their lives, mainly the very old and the very young, who simply could not escape from the fastly moving waters. And within a week, the government of Pakistan declared that this was the worst natural disaster ever to happen in the country. In those first days, there were many injuries to see to, but as I'm sure you'll be hearing from the other speakers also, following a natural disaster, it's what happens, the health consequences, the health needs that happen in the following weeks, months, and even years after a disaster has happened. And Pakistan is a very good example of this. These floods occurred just when the people, and this is a very agrarian society, yeah, most people are farmers. The floods happened when people were going to collect their harvests. So they lost not only their homes, but also all the food that they were expecting to keep them for the next year. When you lose food, what is the consequence? Well, it's malnourishment. And who suffers most? It's young children, always. Also, the wells were flooded, so there was no clean water. The latrines were flooded, so there was many diarrheal diseases, including the terrifying cholera. That water from the floods, and maybe we can have another picture, please. That water sometimes took weeks or months to disappear. So this makes an ideal breeding ground for mosquitoes. And Pakistan in 2010 experienced unprecedented levels of malaria, which is also a killer of young children. And if this is not bad enough, in Pakistan, November, December, the temperatures can drop down to 0 degrees. I had 3 blankets. I couldn't sleep at night, even inside a nice building. Imagine those children, malnourished, forced to live in tents or under plastic sheeting. Many of them started off with a cough. That cough soon became a severe pneumonia. And I remember seeing many children who coming to the clinics, they had malaria, pneumonia, diarrhea, and severe malnutrition. And sadly, many of them did not survive, despite our best medical care, because they were in such critical condition. So clearly, there is an enormous challenge here, as in all natural disasters, as we're going to see in Tonga now, as happened in Haiti, as we're going to hear about soon. It was essential that everybody in healthcare came together very quickly. And what impressed me during my time in Pakistan was how much was done by nurses and midwives. They took key leading roles in this. And I remember watching the webinar from November. Maybe some of the nurses are here now from Lebanon. I heard about the Lebanese nurses who, following that terrible explosion last year, they stopped what they were doing in Beirut. They came to the hospital. They went straight into automatic mode, did all the emergency medical work, and nobody told them what to do. They did not take any orders from anybody because these were professional nurses doing their professional work. And the same thing happened in Pakistan. Many nurses were living and working in small villages and towns, in clinics, small hospitals. They were cut off by the floodwaters. They had limited medical supplies. The communications were down. It didn't stop them doing a first-class professional job for the hundreds of people who were coming to their clinics every day. And also, many people could not come to the clinics because they were living in camps. Yeah, 20 million people lost their homes, and hundreds of thousands of these had to live in camps. They were disorientated, they had no money, they could not get to a clinic or hospital if they were sick. So the answer is to make mobile clinics that can go by car or by boat to reach the camps. And who was organizing these mobile clinics? Nurses and midwives. They were organizing teams of doctors, of pharmacists, of nutritional workers to go to these camps. And they did this in such a good manner, well, an excellent manner, because they were nurses and midwives. And nurses and midwives, as I do not have to tell you, are highly organized people. We all have to organize our clinics, our wards, our patient workloads. We have to look at all the different activities. And this is part of our work. It's in our blood. And not only were they organizing in such a high level, but they were also doing incredible clinical work in the first days to all the injuries that were caused by the floods, but then over the weeks and months, looking after all those critically ill patients, especially children. And just to talk about MSF, I can't talk about the other organizations, but for MSF, in the first 6 months, our nurses did 106,000 consultations around the country. We screened 97,000 children for malnutrition, and we treated 9,000 children in clinics that you can see on the screen now. This mobile clinic, we treated 9,000 children for malnutrition. And our midwives helped deliver 550 babies. Often they were complicated deliveries. So just MSF alone was doing an incredible job assisting the Ministry of Health of Pakistan. And nurses had another vital role, and that's in mental health. And Joanne, of course, is a mental health specialist. He will tell you that in any natural disaster, mental health is a key component in the response. Many people have lost everything. They're traumatized, and that trauma can persist for many weeks and months as post-traumatic stress disorder. Most nurses are not trained to be counselors or trained in psychological first aid, but all nurses are very, very good at giving compassionate care, showing empathy to their patients during the consultation or giving bedside nursing. And this, I believe, 100%, this empathy and understanding that the patients can experience and feel gives them the first step on the road to mental recovery. Now, as Joanne mentioned, natural disasters have to be seen in the context of climate change. And it would be very interesting to hear Katie following this talking about environmental changes. I would just like to say that the disaster in Pakistan was declared by the United Nations to be the first major natural disaster in the world. And I think we can say that climate change, behind all the floods, the hurricanes, is the biggest natural disaster of all. And we can see nowadays millions of people across the planet are on the move because of climate change. They can't farm their lands anymore because of drought, or there's too much flooding, or there's conflict that's also caused by climate change, by people fighting over scarce water supplies. And many of these millions of people, they end up in camps, in transit camps or long-term camps. And who is giving the care in these camps to large numbers of people? Of course, it's nurses and it's midwives. And increasingly, I am seeing the people who are advocating on behalf of these people who are talking about climate change are nurses. They are witnessing and they are speaking up about it internationally. Now, finally, because I don't want to take up too much time, I will just say that I was asked to suggest one thing that can improve nursing and midwives' responses to emergencies. After much thinking, I would like to say it's for people who work with nurses and midwives, doctors, other health professionals, hospital managers, people who work in countries' healthcare systems to really acknowledge what nurses can do. They're incredibly responsible, they have incredible experience, and they can do so much more in their everyday nursing and midwifery jobs, but also in emergency responses. Now, I know that in some countries, nurses don't have the same respect as they have in my country, the United Kingdom, but even 50 years ago in the United Kingdom, nurses had very little responsibility and respect. Now it's very different. And I do hope that our nurses working in emergencies, showing just what they're capable of doing, eventually they will be giving much, much more responsibility. And I'm sure all of you listening today also have the motivation to see this happen. Thank you very much.
Chris, thank you so much for everything that you just said now, for sharing your experiences, but also for clearly being an advocate for nurses and midwives and sending this very important message of other professionals, society even recognizing the role that that nurses and midwives have and the potential that they have to lead. And obviously they are leading already in so many different ways, and you gave so many different examples of how that is happening and happened in Pakistan. I've got a very quick question for you before we move on. Chris, have any lessons been learned when it comes to what happened in Pakistan and how those lessons have been incorporated into local nursing education? Meaning, that big event happened in Pakistan. Nurses were clearly heavily involved, local nurses as well as external nurses. Have any lessons been learned that have been incorporated into how nurses, in this case in Pakistan, are now trained, or there's still a lot of work to do in terms of preparing workforces for these sort of events?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Joanne. And I would say, talking about natural disasters, I talked about the big one in 2010, but there have been many floods since that time, also hurricanes. I mean, so it's an ongoing thing, and we're going to see this more and more, not only in Pakistan, but across the world. And so it's a very relevant question that you ask. I have been back to Pakistan again since then for some other work. And I would say, I think from the nursing and midwifery point of view, there's still a lot of work to do on this. I think still more respect to be given for those working in the health service, although it is changing. And I think from my side, I would like to see that nurses would have something in their curriculum to do with more of a public health perspective, because public health takes on how to deal globally to an emergency response, a natural disaster. And so I think the authorities there did see what nurses could do, and I think that jogged them a little bit. But I think there's probably a lot further to go. But I think in Pakistan, but internationally, I would like nurses to be having a much more training and exposure to more general public health, because that would make them even better prepared for dealing with disasters in the future, wherever they are, whatever kind of disaster it is.
Whatever the crisis it is, yeah, sure,
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you very much, Chris. Hopefully you can continue to talk about this when we all get together for the panel discussion. I'll move on now, thank you very much. So I'll move on now to Katie Huffling. Katie, Chris mentioned the link between climate change and natural disasters, and we have now overwhelming, I would say, evidence that there are so many links between both things. And you come with a different element, which is nursing and midwives and the environment. So really excited to hear about your work, about what the organization that you represent do. So over to you.
Thank you so much. And Chris, that was a really great way to frame this issue. And I think as nurses and midwives on the front lines, that I think that we have an incredible opportunity to help prevent disease and to improve the lives of billions of people if nurses step into a leadership role in addressing climate change. With the significant links between natural disasters and extreme weather events with climate change, I just think it's an incredible opportunity. I like to kind of flip the narrative in that we can have such a positive impact on the lives of billions. Just to set the stage, why we are in the place that we're at. Over the past 50, 75 years, we've had amazing advances, but at the same time, these advances in public health have not always come without a cost. We have more automobiles on the road. In healthcare, we're using more energy than ever before. And most of this energy is created by the burning of fossil fuels. And unfortunately, these result in the release of significant amount of greenhouse gases, which is what is driving climate change. Climate change is linked to loss of biodiversity, loss of tropical rainforests, lack of fresh water, and in disaster preparedness, what we're also seeing is an increased frequency of natural disasters like wildfires, hurricanes, flooding. And besides these, significant short-term issues, it also causes impacts on agriculture, local food supplies, and these can increase instabilities in regions throughout the world, leading to more war and armed conflicts. And so I think, as nurses and midwives working in disaster relief, there's just an amazing opportunity right now to reduce the global burden of disease through efforts that address climate change, and that will reduce the frequency and severity of natural disasters throughout the world. And just as an example of what kind of impact we can have if we address climate change now, we only have a certain amount of time left to really have this positive impact. The current research is showing that there's an increased urgency for action. We really need to be seeing significant reductions in greenhouse gas emissions before 2030 in order to achieve the greatest positive impacts. So if we're able to keep the global average temperature change below 1.5 degrees Celsius, half the number of people globally will experience water scarcity. And instead of 37% of the world's population being regularly exposed to severe heat waves, we'll be able to cut that by more than half to 14%. So it's pretty significant. And unfortunately, as we see with many other issues, it's those living predominantly in low and middle income countries that are now already experiencing the worst impacts of climate change. And as we know, they have the least resources to be resilient in the face of these changes. The UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in their newest assessment, which was released this past summer, they've created a really wonderful set of resources that nurses throughout the world can use to help assess what changes are going to be more prominent in different regions throughout the world. So then you can work with your local agencies, local governments on preparedness, so that you are putting your finite resources in the places where they'll have the greatest positive impact. And there's also a number of wonderful resources for nurses to engage in this. I think, as Christopher was saying, with our holistic approach to health, I think nurses are just in the perfect position to become leaders in addressing climate change. We're seeing the impacts on our patients already. And I think with our we're primed to be leading both locally, but then also with policymakers, because there's many things that we can be doing locally, but if we're not addressing things on a more policy level scale, we're not going to have the changes that we really need to be seeing to have those significant impacts. So just to give you a few examples of nurses, resources that you can be using. This past June, Dr. Patricia Butterfield, Jean Leffers, and Maribel Diaz-Vasquez published a paper in BMJ called Nursing's Pivotal Role in Global Climate Action. And they created this really wonderful framework on how nurses globally can be addressing climate change and how we can really be leaders in pushing strong climate action. So I can post these in the chat as resources, but that's one place where nurses can start thinking about how we can be working together and with our other healthcare colleagues to be addressing climate change. My organization, the Alliance of Nurses for Healthy Environments, we've been working the past couple years with Project Drawdown, which is a scientific organization that assesses what things that we can be doing that will have the greatest impact. So how can we be focusing our finite resources? And we created something called Nurses Drawdown, where we make the connection between climate change and health, and what are some of the areas where nurses could have the greatest impact, both in their nursing practice and then in policy realms. And then a third and final resource, we've partnered with Healthcare Without Harm, which many of you may know. They're another global environmental health organization on the Nurses Climate Challenge. And our goal has been to educate 50,000 health professionals on climate change and climate action. And we've already got almost 30,000 health professionals educated. So there's a growing movement, and all of these resources are free. I'll put them in the chat, but just to get us started, and I hope that these resources will help drive nurses to greater climate action. Thank you.
Katie, thank you very much. And yes, please do share those in the chat. And I was even thinking that maybe, that just, I think that Hannah already replied to the questions that people are asking whether this session is being recorded. So yes, it's being recorded. There will be a link for people who want to watch it again later. And I was wondering whether we can use those opportunities as well, Katie, to share some of the links to the materials that you were talking about, so that we can, because I think they bring so much more tangibility as well to this conversation, isn't it? Kind of coming up with kind of real things that we can do, movements that we can join, actions that we can incorporate into our day-to-day work, or even when it comes to advocating with our own employers, and so on and so forth. So I think that tangibility is really, really welcome. I suspect, at least I'm selfishly saying that, I will really welcome it myself. So I'm hoping that others will do as well. So thank you so much, Katie, and really look forward to looking to all the materials that you spoke and to find out more about alliances of nurses for healthy environments. Okay, so Katie, you're in America. We're going to move a little bit further south, and I'm going to invite Yves Carmel Fanfan. Bonjour, Yves, bienvenue. Yves is the Vice President of the Nursing and Midwifery Association of Haiti. And Yves, you are the Vice President of a group of health professionals working in a country which throughout history and over the past decade has been affected by catastrophic natural disasters that have led to tremendous human loss. And so we're really keen to hear about your experience of leading such organization and of yours and your colleagues' role during these crises. So again, bienvenue, and over to you, Yves.
Bonjour à tout le monde et merci d'avoir fait choix de l'Association des sages-femmes pour participer dans cet atelier. Et l'Association des sages-femmes, c'est une association professionnelle qui regroupe les infirmières d'un temps qui avaient pris la formation de sage-femme et les sages-femmes entrées directes. Donc tout de suite après la philo, elles ont passé 3 ans à l'école de sage-femme pour être sage-femme. Donc, en termes de catastrophes naturelles, donc on pourrait dire que c'est nouveau pour nous à notre âge en Haïti. Donc, en 2010, nous avons vécu un terrible tremblement de terre qui a coûté la vie à beaucoup de gens. Donc, on parle d'environ de 300 000 morts dans notre pays et plusieurs des milliers d'handicaps et de personnes disparues. Et nous pouvons dire que d'après les chiffres qu'on a publiés, on a eu à peu près 50 à 60% des infrastructures de notre pays qui étaient dévastées par ce tremblement de terre. Mais en 2010, jusqu'à date, c'était nouveau pour plein de gens dans notre pays. Je pourrais dire, même pour le gouvernement. Moi-même, j'avais 30 ans. C'est pour la première fois que j'ai vécu une telle situation. Donc, après le tremblement de 2010, on pourrait dire jusqu'à présent que nous avons un pays qui est encore dévasté par le tremblement de terre de 2010. Et le 14 septembre 2021, 10 ans après, nous avons vécu une autre catastrophe naturelle. Donc, pour nous, dans notre association, et c'est à partir du tremblement de terre du 14 août 2021 qu'on a mis sur pied des réflexions là-dessus pour nos professionnels de la santé. Moi-même, en tant qu'infirmière et sage-femme, dans mon cursus de formation, malheureusement, j'avais pas eu de formation là-dessus. Sauf en 2010, après, j'ai regardé sur les vidéos et les témoignages des gens et comment se protéger quand il y a des tremblements de terre. Donc vraiment, nous qui étions formés, nous n'avons pas eu une formation, on pourrait dire d'emblée, sur ces genres de catastrophes naturelles. Donc dans notre association, nous avons pensé que c'est une urgence de faire des formations et des séances de simulation pour nos professionnels sages-femmes et nos professionnels qui étaient déjà infirmières, qui sont aussi des sages-femmes. Donc, tout récemment, nous avons contracté un ingénieur civil qui travaille dans la gestion des risques et des désastres, parce qu'au sein de l'association, nous avons des employés, nous avons un bureau, mais nous avons aussi un inspecteur au bureau, et un jour, un employé nous avait fait la recommandation pour dire que oui, c'est vrai, s'il y a du feu qui est arrivé au niveau du local, on ne peut rien faire. Il y a l'inspecteur vraiment, mais on ne peut pas s'en servir. Donc, avec tout ça, on a pensé à faire des formations pour nos employés et pour les sages-femmes qui sont aussi membres de l'association des sages-femmes. Et comme témoignage des différentes sages-femmes qu'on a contactées pour parler des catastrophes naturelles. Donc, vous savez déjà et vous connaissez que nos professionnels qui vivent en Haïti, elles travaillent vraiment dans des conditions difficiles. Vraiment difficiles. Par exemple, une sage-femme qui n'est pas d'un département, elle sort de l'ouest, elle s'est rendue dans le département du sud. Donc là, c'est très difficile pour y accéder. Il y a déjà des situations politiques qui ont aggravé la situation du pays. Il y a une zone dans l'ouest qui s'appelle Mortissan. Donc, la sage-femme ne peut pas traverser la zone de Mortissan pour se rendre au travail. Donc, quand il est au travail, il peut passer 2 à 3 mois loin de sa famille. Donc, il est obligé de rester au poste pour plusieurs mois. Et à part la précarité des conditions de travail, il y a toujours des manques de personnel dans les institutions. Donc, la sage-femme qui est là ou bien l'infirmière qui est là, elles sont bousculées par le travail parce que le plus souvent, elles sont seules. Elles travaillent de jour, elles travaillent pendant l'après-midi, elles travaillent 24 heures sur 24, on pourrait dire 7 jours sur 7. Donc, c'est vraiment extrême le travail que font les infirmières et les sages-femmes en Haïti, surtout dans les périodes de crise. Donc, les sages-femmes, après le séisme, elle n'a pas seulement travaillé en maternité, elle est allée là où il y a les blessés, à la maison, dans les postes de rassemblement. Elle participe aussi avec les infirmières et les autres professionnels de la santé pour faire des soins, par exemple, faire des pansements, des choses qu'elles peuvent faire. Donc, pour nous, comme suggestion, nous avons pensé que les professionnels de la santé doivent avoir dans leur cursus de formation et des cours qui sont en rapport avec le changement climatique et les catastrophes naturelles. Et pensez, pour les professionnels qui sont déjà formés, pensez à faire des séances de simulation dans les travails ou bien dans les lieux où elles se trouvent pour qu'elles puissent s'habituer avec cette situation. Parce que nous ne sommes pas habitués quand il y a des secousses, les médecins, les infirmières, les sages-femmes, elles courent par-ci et par-là, elles ne savent même pas où se rendre pour se protéger. Donc, je pense que si on fait les séances de simulation, comme ça, tout le monde pourrait aller à un endroit pour se protéger et attendre que les secousses passent pour sortir. Et ensuite, il y a avec les conditions de travail qui sont, on pourrait dire, qui sont inappropriées pour les professionnels de la santé. Les employeurs, ils doivent valoriser le travail que font les professionnels infirmiers et les professionnels sages-femmes. Et on pourrait dire, à part les associations peut-être, créer des espaces de loisirs pour les infirmières et les sages-femmes. Et surtout, après les catastrophes naturelles, donner un apport ou bien un appui psychologique pour ces professionnels de la santé. Parce que ces professionnels, elles sont au premier rang avec les patients, donc elles doivent être même en bonne santé mentale pour prendre en charge les autres patients ou bien les parturientes ou bien les gestantes. Et ensuite, montrer aux gens comment prendre soin d'elles-mêmes. Par exemple, si l'infirmière, elle est seule, c'est vrai, mais tu travailles, tu ne peux pas travailler de 8 heures à 4 heures sans prendre une petite pause pour aller prendre du café et faire quelque chose pour au moins laisser un temps au cerveau de prendre du sucre et de recommencer après. Et ensuite, donner plus de compétences à ces professionnels et sages-femmes ou infirmiers pour aider, accompagner les populations dans les catastrophes naturelles. Quand je dis ça en termes de prendre en charge les urgences, pas seulement pour les sages-femmes, les urgences obstétricales, mais les urgences dans les grandes catastrophes naturelles. Donc, les catastrophes naturelles et le changement climatique, donc, on pourrait dire c'est quelque chose qu'on devrait et qu'on va vivre avec. Et ça pour arriver à trouver une solution, donc nous devons travailler ensemble pour s'entraider. En gros, c'est ce que j'avais comme partage d'expérience et de témoignages pour cette rencontre. Merci beaucoup.
Oh, thank you, Yves. Merci beaucoup for sharing with us not just the experiences of yourself and your midwife and nursing colleagues in Haiti, but also for telling us about the incredible role that your association seems to be having in Haiti, filling a very important gap around training and preparedness of nurses, which links very much to what Christopher and Katie mentioned earlier, the importance of providing more training. And it sounds like we can talk of general training of how to deal with natural disasters, but also to focus on specific world regions and specific countries like Haiti that, because of the geographical position of the country between the tectonic plates, that probably, for example, training around how to respond to an earthquake seems to be very, very, very important. I'm amazed with your capacity, you and your colleagues' capacity to work under what sounds like absolutely extremely difficult conditions. So you have all my respect and admiration, and I'm sure that all our colleagues here feel the same way. So thank you very much, Yves. I'll move on now to Jeff Tani, who's also in Haiti, also from the Nursing and Midwives Association of Haiti. Jeff Tani, it would be great to hear from you as well and about your experiences of working as a midwife in Haiti. We heard Yves talking about the story of a colleague of yours that crossed this very dangerous area and stayed in the health post for weeks on end. I mean, what an amazing, unbelievable commitment to the profession and to the local people. Let's hear from you, Jeff Tani, and about your experiences and thoughts of what we're talking about. So welcome, bienvenue. Jeff Tani, are you there? Can you hear us? I don't know if the interpreters can hear us. Okay. You can't hear Jeff Tani. Okay. Let's just wait a few seconds. If we can't hear Jeff Tani, maybe we'll jump on to Stephen, if that's okay, and then we'll try again Jeff Tani. Is that okay?
Oui, je pense parce que Jeff Tani, elle est en route pour se rendre dans son lieu de travail à Belader. Sûrement, il y a peut-être une coupure. Je vais lui parler et ensuite, elle pourra présenter.
Okay. Thank you, Yves. Thank you for letting us know. Stephen, do you mind if we jump to you and you tell us about your work and what you're doing in the American Hub and hear your thoughts on what we're talking about today. So welcome, Stephen. Welcome to the webinar.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. And I definitely want to start off by saying that while, yes, I do live in Houston, Texas, and I identify as a Peruvian American, a lot of what has shaped my view in the world of disaster response and many things in general was the formative years I had growing up overseas in locations such as South America, in Russia, in Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and then coming to Houston for high school. And then I stayed within the United States. And so I think I want to address something really quickly on a recurring theme I've seen in some of the comments in the chat, which is some individuals stating that they have not had the opportunity yet to work in a natural disaster setting. And I definitely want to challenge individuals who may identify with that as that they have not had the opportunity. Everywhere on the planet has different disasters that they either routinely go through or intermittently. And so if we're to use the US as an example, we have a number of individuals who have been moving to Texas as of late. And for individuals who may be within the United States who are moving, wherever you move to, especially if you come to Texas or to Houston, which is by the Gulf Coast, one must be aware and educate oneself on exactly what hurricane preparation is like, because much like there's living in Southeast Asia, where there's a monsoon season, in the US we have hurricane season as well, which is roughly from April to November. And so for everyone out there who's not currently in a disaster scenario, this is, using a sports analogy, this is the off season, and this is where you prepare. A lot of the things that can best assist in disaster mitigation is the amount of preparation that individuals do ahead of time. We all want to believe and hope that wherever we live, that our respective governments, et cetera, will be able to care for everyone, but that is simply not the case. There's a wide level of what governments are able to do locally, on a state level, district, county, and on a national level. Specific to my background within disaster, I'm a part of a volunteer group known as the Disaster Emergency Medical Personnel System. It is a group of medical volunteers within the Department of Veterans Affairs, which is where I work as a registered nurse. And whenever a call is put out requesting personnel for either an impending disaster or a disaster that has occurred, then we volunteers go in and assist as best we can. And it's very long, hard days. We're typically talking at least 12 hours a day consecutively. I mean, it's very common to do 12-hour shifts in a row in these very hyper-focused disaster scenarios. And so when I reflect on the course of my life, when I was a senior in high school, Hurricane Katrina is what occurred and devastated the city of New Orleans. And later on that year, in Houston, Hurricane Rita came, and many individuals were worried that Rita would devastate the city of Houston, much like Katrina did. The short answer is it did not. And the lesson from that I want to emphasize is that the traditional model of being able to stay with the routine, we can expect this, or we can expect that. We have had far too many storms of the centuries to continue using the term storm of the century or natural disaster of the century. And so Houston, as a result of Rita, Houstonians, we became a little bit complacent in believing that we were too far inland to ever be devastated by a hurricane. And in 2008, when Hurricane Ike hit, we learned very quickly that we were not immune. And that was re-emphasized in 2017 when we were hit by Hurricane Harvey, where we were hit with over 50 inches of rain. And apologies, we're not doing the metric conversion for those of us outside of the United States. But in an effort to stay within time and minutes, everyone that is accessing this right now, the one thing I hope everyone can do at a bare minimum is something as simple as just checking the weather for that day. It may be winter where you are, it may be summer where you are, and there's an expected range, but to at least stay up to date on the weather forecast will give you so much information so that you won't be sidetracked when there's a surprise cold front, and things of that nature. And when the panel discussion occurs, I'd be happy to go into more detail as far as the different things that was done in the earthquakes for Puerto Rico and New Orleans and some of the other disasters that I've assisted with.
Stephen, thank you very much for sharing your experience and for your thoughts. I was thinking of lots of things as you were giving examples, and you talked about mitigation. You talked about people saying, and I haven't had experience of natural disasters, and what you just said now at the end, it's just so important and such a good example of how really today it really doesn't matter where you are in the world for you to actually experience the natural disaster. I mean, I was just thinking of, for example, somehow I think here in Europe we are often we think that we are almost immune to natural disasters, and people associate natural disasters with something that will happen in the southern hemisphere, which is wrong, and it's an absolute shame that people think that. This summer we had terrible floodings in Germany, and somehow that seems to have woken up a lot of people and say, oh, this is quite close to home, which is very interesting because they're already happening. We know that climate change is happening. We know that natural disasters are happening. At the moment, I'm not, although I am UK's home, I'm in Spain at the moment. I'm talking to you from Spain. We haven't had rain for several weeks, and people are already talking about a possible drought in the summer. Summers in Europe are becoming increasingly hot. So what kind of implications that has to nurses? So I think, this point of not experiencing natural disasters, where do natural disasters occur? I think that having this conversation is really important so that we understand that this is about all of us, and that all of us can have a role and can be involved and should be involved in this conversation. Don't know if that makes sense, but those are kind of the thoughts that were crossing on my mind as I heard you talking, Stephen. So thank you very much. Look forward to continuing this conversation through our panel discussion. I just wanted to check again with Jeftani or Eve, or maybe one of the interpreters, to see whether Jeftani is with us.
Elle était branchée, mais je pense que je vais essayer de la rejoindre pour voir est-ce qu'elle est connectée. Parce qu'elle perd le signal de temps à autre.
Okay, no problem. Let's then slowly move on to our panel discussion. And I'll invite all of you to take part in this panel discussion, and then hopefully if Jeftani joins us, do let us know, Jeftani or the interpreters or Eve, and then hopefully we can use that space as well for Jeftani to share her experiences with us. So panel discussions are very open. Obviously we try to touch in some of the themes that we discuss or individual guests discussed throughout the webinar. Lots of ideas came out of all of your interventions. So I would start by asking from all of you participants, what kind of support mechanisms could be implemented to support nurses and midwives working in areas affected by natural disasters? I mean, we heard about what's been happening in Haiti. I've seen through the chat box a lot of people from various different countries mentioning about their experiences of working in natural disasters as nurses and midwives. So in reality, if we're thinking globally, as a global community, everyone interested in nursing and midwives and wanting to advocate for nurses and midwives, what kind of steps could be taken to implement support mechanisms that are really effective to every single nurse and midwife working in these circumstances? And maybe I'll start with you, Chris. Maybe if you would like to have a go on this. Any thoughts on this very broad topic?
Yes, and again, we have touched on it in the beginning. I think this is very important, and I think it's making people aware that nurses are capable of doing so much. Because if you can make people in responsibility, the authorities, you mentioned society, John, where maybe the money is coming from, for example, from governments, then you can make up a program and you can really build up. You can expand the curriculum, but you can develop the support that's also coming to nurses as well. But I think it needs, because when we talk about a natural disaster, you know, Yves mentioned Haiti. That was a catastrophe for the country. It's a national emergency. Nurses stood up there in a you know, to meet it. Same as in Pakistan, the Pakistan nurses, the Lebanese nurses I mentioned from the last webinar. And everyone can do things individually, but it really needs the support across the board, yeah? From authorities. They need to recognize it, because then it's only then that you're going to get the investment coming into the health services to provide training. Maybe for Yves mentioned the mental health needs of people, of nurses and midwives as well, very important. Again, this needs investment for training people to think of further training. So I think it has to be an initiative that comes to from the very highest level, and people need to realize that what nurses are doing. So again, it needs advocacy, I think, on behalf of nurses and other parts of civil society to really get that momentum building up, to get the investment, to then you can look at education, you look at other forms of support for the nurses. Okay, I think I will leave it for the moment and let somebody else come in.
Yeah, you are on mute.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you.
By the way,
Excusez-moi, Jeff Daniel veut présenter, oui?
Jeff Tanney has a hand up.
Sure, Jeff Tanney, let's hear from you.
Bonjour.
Bonjour.
Je dis bonjour à tout le monde. Je suis vraiment désolée parce que là maintenant, je suis en route pour me rendre à la cette zone où je vais sous forme de consultante pour les Nations Unies parce qu'on a une situation en Haïti. La République dominicaine n'arrête pas de quitter le monde, y compris les femmes enceintes. Donc, les Nations Unies, à travers l'UNFPA, a utilisé une stratégie pour essayer de voir comment on peut répondre à cette situation. Donc là, maintenant, je suis en route pour me rendre à Beladia. Donc, parfois, la connexion d'Internet ne passe pas trop bien. C'est pour ça que je n'ai pas pu me présenter tout à l'heure. Donc là, maintenant, je suis Jeftani Mathurin. Je suis responsable de communication de l'Association des infirmières sages-femmes d'Haïti. Donc, c'est un plaisir pour moi de participer à mon tout premier webinaire de GHPGO avec les infirmières et les sages-femmes en réponse avec les catastrophes naturelles. Donc là, maintenant, je vais essayer d'aller un tout petit peu plus court au cas où il y aurait une autre coupure. Donc, je suis une jeune sage-femme. Lorsqu'il y a eu le séisme du 12 janvier, j'avais 12 ans. Je ne m'y connaissais pas trop, y compris, comme l'a dit tout à l'heure, presque toute la population haïtienne. Et en 2010, lorsqu'il y a eu le tremblement de terre, ça a frappé particulièrement le département de l'Ouest. Ce qui signifie que la majeure partie des autres départements ne connaissaient pas vraiment ou n'étaient pas vraiment affectés par le tremblement de terre. Et là, dernièrement, le tremblement de terre, le séisme, a frappé particulièrement la zone sud du pays. Ce qui signifie que ça n'a pas frappé comme ça l'a été pour le département de l'Ouest. Donc, les habitants du sud qui ne connaissaient pas vraiment, qui n'ont pas été vraiment affectés par le séisme en 2010, ont été comme frappés par le séisme pour la première fois. Et jusqu'à présent, 12 ans après, nous ne sommes toujours pas prêts pour ce genre de catastrophe naturelle. Parce que, et par rapport aux témoignages que j'ai pu récolter auprès des sages-femmes qui travaillaient dans le sud, la majeure partie des gens qui ont été fracturés, qui ont été blessés, qui ont même été tués par une méconnaissance de comment réagir face à cette situation-là. Et comme vous pouvez le savoir, Haïti est un pays à faible revenu. Et quand on dit un pays à faible revenu, on voit des impacts négatifs sur tous les points, que ce soit au niveau d'éducation, que ce soit au niveau de santé, etc., de structures hospitalières. Donc là, maintenant, les sages-femmes ont été dans une situation assez particulière parce que, premièrement, c'est pour la première fois qu'elles vivaient ce genre de situation, de voir tous ces gens blessés et frappés, etc., et même morts. Donc là maintenant, non seulement elle devait s'occuper des femmes qui étaient en travail, c'est qu'en maternité, on n'a pas vraiment de timing. Donc, là, pendant que l'opération, les sages-femmes ont dû s'armer de courage malgré les secousses de rentrer, de voir ce qu'elles peuvent faire.
That's okay. I can see that the image is frozen as well. I mean, this makes me, as we were trying to listen to Jeff Tani and to what the interpreter was saying, this made me think about the practical, logistical. Jeff Tani, I don't know if you can hear me.
Enlève la caméra, Jeff Tani.
OK.
Jeff Tani,
Est-ce que vous me recevez là maintenant?
Jeff Tani, I don't know if you can hear me. What I was saying, we heard bits of what you said. So thank you very much for sharing your experience of working as a young midwife throughout what was clearly a very difficult episode in the recent history of Haiti. And we were struggling sometimes to listen to you, and that made me think of the logistical challenges that that nurses and midwives face in world areas like the country that you're in, particularly when there are natural disasters. And connecting to what we were talking about before, about the importance of developing support systems, of making sure that information reaches out to every nurse and midwife in terms of training, in terms of information. How can we overcome these obstacles? And I don't know if Stephen, if you're there, you mentioned about working in various different settings and scenarios. How did you overcome this need to reach out to all health professionals when the circumstances are really difficult? And in examples like this, where even just having a platform like the one that we're having today and trying to communicate with Jeff Tani and Eve was full of challenges, in practical terms, how do you overcome this when thinking about support systems that could help staff in these circumstances?
You know, when I think of this question and disaster as a whole, I think one of the things that those of us, especially with good intentions, and for those who want answers, is that there isn't a one-size-fits-all model. And there is a tendency within affluent nations to want to assist in Haiti and other areas and say, this is the way that we're going to fix things. And so really, if you don't have buy-in from the community, if you don't have a community that believes in what you have, it could be the best quote, it could be the best plan out there, but it's going to fail unless those who are actually living in the community on a regular basis and those who are working on a regular basis, unless they have a say in how it works. It's one thing to present different ideas that maybe the community hasn't thought of, but make sure that the community is the one that is adopting and implementing, because when we as disaster workers are gone, the community will have to continue with whatever plan that they have chosen. And so kind of back to the root of the question, you know, how is it that one connects with healthcare workers, et cetera, in the actual moment? It's one, being open to listening to what they're going through at that time. I mean, when I think of when I was in Puerto Rico in January of 2020, a lot of it was listening to my fellow coworkers who came from different parts of the island, and hearing not just what was necessary in the hospital we were working at, but what was necessary in that community, and trying to, in addition, be a voice of listening, but to stay centered in being able to provide support for everyone that's there, because we can't control what happens to us. We can't control when a tornado or an earthquake can occur, but we can control our response and our emotions and our actions to it. And the more we practice in smaller problems, the better prepared we will be for when larger ones occur. Yeah, I'll close on that so that others have the opportunity to speak, and if there's other questions that come up.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense, Stephen. What you mentioned about consulting local communities, local healthcare workforces, I think that's so important when thinking about potential training and materials that can be of use to healthcare staff, and specifically to nurses and midwives, not make assumptions of what might or might not work, and involving local healthcare workforces when we build those resources, and also making sure that in addition to training, that whoever is receiving that training, nurses or midwives or other health professionals, have the resources to put their knowledge into practice, because that often happens in not just in kind of disaster response activities, but just even in international development. I think that we make assumptions about what's needed in terms of training. We come in and we deliver all this training, and we haven't checked first of all whether it's suitable. We haven't heard local people's and local healthcare workforces' points of view, and we haven't checked whether the local healthcare workforce will be able to put that knowledge into practice, whether the resources, the environment, even the support from their employers is there to put their knowledge into practice. So there's, I think, a really important point that this is not just about thinking about what kind of resources, it's also going beyond that and looking at the environment and whether the environment is appropriate and adequate for people to put that knowledge into practice. Katie,
You went back on mute.
I'm sorry. I was just saying, Katie, if you wanted to add anything based as well on the work that you do and the Alliance of Nurses and the potential that you see in the nurses and midwifery workforce to have a much more active advocacy role in this.
I think in many parts of the world, we're such an untapped resource. We're the largest portion of the healthcare workforce, and if we're not at the table, I think it's such a missed opportunity. I think both within our healthcare infrastructure as well as within the policy realm, the hierarchical nature historically has in some areas kind of pushed nursing to the side and not really included us as full partners. And I think, having nurses at the table is going to be critical in both in this type of work, not disaster preparedness, but also around addressing climate change. Just as an example, I and several of nurses who are part of my organization were able to go to COP26 in Glasgow. And there were very few nurses there. And in talking with physicians that were there, there's still, I think, for many physicians, a surprise that nurses are interested in this topic or engaged in it. And so I think, we've got a lot of work to do, but they're also really open. They recognize, they're like, oh yes, nurses are on the ground, we're in every community, and if we're not tapping into that resource, we're not going to be able to tackle this crisis.
That's really good, Katie. So we know that the doors are open, but how can we make sure that there are more of us sitting at that table? It's really good to hear that you were able to make it to the COP26, but what kind of, is there any advocacy movement that we can be doing individually as, the crowds that are listening to us today to generate that movement or to give more of a momentum to that movement? Because what I'm very aware of is that we often talk almost, we're preaching to the converted, isn't it? We are kind of, we are, most of us here are nurses and midwives. So how do we move beyond? And that, Chris, you also mentioned the importance of talking to other health professionals. So what do you think needs to happen for the conversation to jump outside of our own circle?
Well, I think one thing that we can do is to be talking with our either local or national nursing organizations, that this is an area that is really important, that nurses need to be engaged with, and to be really pushing those organizations to be at the table, because they, you know, do have those connections, whether it's with other medical organizations or with policymakers. And if they start engaging in those issues, then those folks that have that power will start recognizing nurses as leaders in this area.
That makes a lot of sense. So tapping into the nursing associations, the body that represents us, and who probably are the ones that will have easier access to decision makers, isn't it, and policy makers. Thank you, Katie. Time is never on our side. I mean, you know, I could go on with more and more questions. One question leads to something else. And so the temptation is there, but unfortunately, time just isn't on our side. So I am going to leave the group discussion there and move on to reintroduce our next guests, Health Action training. And Pat and Matt, you joined us on the last webinar on war and conflict and gave us examples of really good training programs that are on offer out there for nurses and midwives working in that case, areas of war and conflict. And today, I'm going to ask you the same question, thinking about our colleagues working in areas affected by natural disasters. I suspect that there's probably a lot of similarities in terms of the training that is out there, the opportunities out there. So over to you guys. Really good to have you back with us.
Okay, thank you, John. And hello to everyone. My name is Pat Denny, and I'm the CEO of Health Action Training. I'm a nurse educator. And for about 30 years, I've been involved in preparing and assisting nurses to actually prepare for disasters and cope with recovery after disasters. And my colleague here, Matt Jennings, has worked with me more recently in developing some very creative methods to actually improve that training. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take you through some slides here that actually give us from some frameworks that we work from, and some of the an overview of some of the courses that we can offer and how it could help you. Hopefully this should work. Everyone could see that, yeah?
Yep.
Okay. So as I said, we really, our training is actually about helping people in leadership to develop leadership skills in crisis, but also then to help them with self-care, resilience, and being able to cope both during and after. But really, today is about actually nurses finding their voice and speaking up. And I was just, as the panel were speaking, I was thinking of that evening or night in October 2001, when we were all invited from across the world. There was nurses from Japan, Australia, Southeast Asia, South America, etc., all of Europe, invited by the US government after 9/11 to look at actually how nurses can develop competency in relation to responding to the types of emergencies that might have developed at that stage. And there was a professor of public health in the United States said, "This is our opportunity." So I wanted to re-emphasize the importance of actually focusing on climate change, because climate change is going to be hopefully resourced in most countries. This is an opportunity for nurses to actually find their voice and really re-emphasize the need to actually become better prepared in disaster response and preparedness. For me, the framework is most important. All healthcare, anyone working in disasters needs to know this, but particularly nurses need to be introduced to this whole idea of knowing the balance between the capacity of a community to respond and the vulnerabilities. And starts with simple questions, asking local authorities, what types of vulnerabilities do you think exist? And we did projects recently in Ireland, particularly in the Northwest, where we invited nurses to actually just ask their local community what they felt the vulnerabilities were. And this is in communities that actually had experienced war and conflict over the troubles in Northern Ireland, but now they had to rethink in relation to climate change. And one thing that comes out in all of this is actually the risk of poor communication and disjointedness between teams and disjointedness between professionals and community. So there needs to be greater awareness, better effective health programs. Look, if you don't have an effective health program in your community, then a disaster or strikes, you're obviously going to be more overwhelmed. So the idea of disaster always stems from the community being overwhelmed. So the better capacity that the community has, and just as a citizen alone in any country, the nurse needs to step forward here. But it's not as easy as just saying you must step forward. You need support and training. And the International Council of Nurses, since 2019, well, actually, even since after 9/11, 2001, 2002, they've been always developing, giving nurses a framework for what they should be thinking, how they should structure their education. And we in Health Action Training use these frameworks as a guide. And I think everybody would know that there's 3 levels of actually expectation. All registered nurses. Level 2 is a trainer leadership role, and level 3 then is similar to what Stephen's referring to, people who are able to deploy to other states, to other countries to help in disaster situations. And the ICN have actually said that there's 8 domains as well. They've given guidance on but domain 1 and domain 2, which is around readiness and having confidence to step forward and to communicate with other professionals and work collaboratively with local community, which was emphasized a lot. And the opportunity now is there when we think about climate change. This is another opportunity. Matt, what about health action training?
Yeah, so in health action training, we use techniques from actor training and drama to develop ways to share existing knowledge and also to develop imaginative solutions to practical problems you're facing in whatever situation. So I was hearing a lot of people today talking about the importance of valorization and respect for the existing knowledge that nurses have on their ground and the skill set they have on the ground. And basically, the simple answer is people generally know what they need to solve a problem when they've been dealing with the problem. How do they share that knowledge with each other? How do they discover or create new and imaginative solutions to them? Also in relation to trauma and how do we process a disaster after it's happened. If we can make meaning together of the sorts of things that we've dealt with and then develop our confidence in our ability to listen to and understand and then create solutions together, then we can also help to process trauma. In fact, if you look at the research of Bessel van der Kolk in the very popular book, The Body Keeps the Score, he talks about how the symbolic transformation through communal action of doing theatre can help us to process trauma. And then in terms of leadership and advocacy, it's not that nurses don't know what's needed and nurses don't know how to say it. It's how do they develop the confidence and the access to share that information within their groups, with colleagues, with communities, and with each other, which can also help to manage the damage done by trauma. Because if you feel you're a part of a network that is supportive and is developing your confidence and your ability to communicate what you need immediately in the moment of disaster through triage, or in the processes of lobbying to policy groups afterwards, then you're developing that capacity and that agency and that to develop advocacy on behalf of your needs. So basically, at a very simple level, we use drama to share our ideas on what we need and how to communicate them, how to listen and how to respond, how to clarify objectives, and how to work creatively as a group to process the challenges we've gone through in terms of mental health, and also to share practical solutions to the difficulties we're facing on the ground. And we always start with acknowledging that nurses have experiences that have taught them things that nobody else will know, that in 99% of the time, a nurse will have developed great skill in communication with colleagues, with patients, with family members, with communities, with other disciplines. They're not necessarily always conscious of what those skills are. So we use drama to make explicit what is it that we do when things are going well? How do we use the learning from those experiences and share them with each other? And how do we practice and rehearse them so that we're learning through dialogue with each other about what we know, we're learning through imagination, through creative solutions, and we're learning through experience by rehearsing and practicing those things. So I've been working with Pat for the last 9 years, and one of the things that we did every year was a disaster response training scenario with groups like the Red Cross and St. John's Ambulance, local paramedics, local police officers, local community groups, and we would have a wide range of local disasters possibilities such as earthquakes, floods, explosions, etc. And even at the very simplest level, with a brief amount of time, we could say that if you're training in simulation for those kind of events, one very simple thing to clarify for yourself is, what is my objective in this situation? Do I need to evacuate people from the place? Do I need to set up a triage tent? Do I need to treat people who have, immediate urgent healthcare issues? A simple physical objective clarified within the group on its own, that can make a massive difference to how a role play or a simulation exercise can provide helpful solutions. So we're providing 12-hour courses as part of this project over the next 3 years with Nursing Now, which are coping with crisis, well-being and growth. And that can include crisis such as being in a conflict zone, being in a natural disaster area, or the global crisis that we're all facing at the minute with the COVID pandemic. How do we engage in ways that we can look after ourselves as helpers? And it goes beyond self-care. As the Nagoski sisters point out, self-care is not enough. We need to actually create a culture of caring for each other, everyone caring for each other. And that's at the political and systemic level, as well as at the intrapersonal, moment-by-moment presence between two human beings. So we do this 12-hour course on how do we deal with problems. You present the problems you're facing, and we share creative ways of discovering solutions, developing our confidence in speaking on our behalf, identifying our needs, and then communicating them to others, and understanding other people's needs when they communicate them to us. And if anybody would be looking to sort of do a more in-depth exploration of the technique, where basically any situation you're dealing with in your professional life, you bring to the course, and then we use these dramatic techniques to explore how to create different outcomes and to explore the possibilities. And once we're working with imagination, we discover things that we never would have thought possible if we simply base it upon previous procedures. So if you went to the next slide, Pat, the other course you can do is a 35-hour course.
The 35-hour course is it's actually very well suited to actually people that wish to develop their level 2 skills. That's leading teams and interacting with local political representatives and council and so forth, and
leadership team, interdisciplinary teams. And both of those qualifications are certificated by the UK Royal College of Nursing, and therefore can be used in sort of developing your professional portfolio. And then following on from that, if you do the 35-hour course, we're also through Nursing Now over the next 3 years offering Train the Trainers courses, so that when we train you in these skills, you can deploy them amongst your teams on the ground in your local communities in your country, and be sensitive to the cultural context. And you know better than we do what the answers are to your problems. We just have a way that you can frame those problems, that you can understand them, and you can transfer knowledge, and you can communicate effectively. So over the next 3 years, we'll be doing, I think it's 6 12-hour coping with crisis courses, 3 graduate certificate courses per year, and 1 trainer's course for each year. So if you're interested in signing up for any of that and sharing your knowledge in this way with your colleagues, then contact Nursing Now.
Yeah, and just to add, finally, our long-term intention is to actually have international hubs in different parts of the world. So that means that actually, the courses are really reflecting the needs of the region. and the nurses that are actually working in that area. So, and that'll involve collaboration with local community drama groups, which is really important. We're sending out this slide presentation as well, so you'll actually have access to all of these references, which have chapters on our work. So thank you very much, John.
Pat and Matt, this is the second time, that I heard you talking about your courses, but I was just thinking what a privilege it is for all of us to have access to what you're offering, the courses that you're offering, about using drama as such a powerful tool for us to build these skills, for us to know how to connect with each other, how to connect with ourselves, how to provide person-centered care. How important is that, both in terms of the context that we're talking about, but even in terms of, our daily routine work lives and even our personal lives, if I'm honest. So thank you very much for bringing the examples of the courses that you provide here today. I forgot to mention that most of you must have seen on the chat box that there's actually a link of how to apply for the courses that Health Action Training is providing us for free. The other thing I wanted to say as well, just to add to what Pat and Matt were saying, is that if we have seen on the chat box so many comments of people saying, I've worked on this situation and that situation. We had people from all sorts of places. I've been jotting down the countries that I've seen listed: Tanzania, Dubai, Italy, Bangladesh, Egypt. So really fantastic to have so many people from so many places around the world. Pat, you just mentioned now that you're developing those modules considering the regional characteristics of various different parts of the world, which is fantastic as well. So really good to have so many people sharing their experiences with us and just saying that they've been in similar situations to the ones described, for example, by Eve and Jeff Darney. If you want, so we're going to have more sessions like these ones in the future. As again, the plan has been for us to have 3 webinars in the hope that we'll continue to have more, because more themes will emerge, more questions will emerge. And if you do want to take part in these webinars on nursing and midwifery crisis, do write to us, specifically to the email info@nursingnow.global. That's info@nursingnow.global. Share your stories, tell us about yourself, and we'd be absolutely delighted to hear from you. We've got 2 minutes. I do have one particular question here in the chat box that some of you might have seen. Let me see if I can need my glasses, otherwise I can't read it. From Hussein Bahazinka, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, that says, despite all mentioned key responsibilities done by nurses and midwives, why are they not appreciated by governments? Why, which is quite a big question, isn't it? Why they're not appreciated by governments? I don't know if any of you wants to give it a try and answer this question. Why do we not get the recognition yet from so many governments across the world? Anyone wants to give it a try?
Yeah, if I go first, Joe.
Sure.
That reminds me actually of Sarajevo in the early 90s. Where governments were being reformed. They were actually, the country of Yugoslavia was breaking up. You have got to see the opportunity, and even though you're actually going and what seems like stating the obvious about the care, the support, the versatility, the adaptability of nurses. You've just got to re-emphasize that, and very quickly, if leaders, political leaders, actually have family or relatives that were helped by nurses, that's usually all it takes. It's as simple as that.
I'd like to say, on one level, I think there's a patriarchal situation where the majority of nurses are women, or they're operating within patriarchal societies, which might diminish any role seen as predominantly women-based. And unfortunately, one aspect of that is we can sometimes, male or female, no matter what society we're in, as givers and helpers, we can sort of be a bit self-effacing. I'm not trying to blame nurses for their own lack of respect, but I do know that sometimes when we're working with nurses and we do the health action training and we develop their confidence to speak up on their own behalf, say challenge doctors, challenge local authorities, challenge other community members, challenge teammates, challenge patients or family members, and develop a confidence in their own ability and their right to speak, and the importance of developing a belief in the natural right of everyone to speak up on their own behalf, we can start to challenge those more oppressive, bigger structures.
Absolutely, Matt. And I think that's where probably leadership training becomes so important, where you know how to use your voice, when, how, and how to make it most effective, isn't it? That's where, you know, ideas like leadership and the Nursing Now movement has been very much pointing in that direction of, you know, looking at the current and the future nursing and midwifery leaders. And I think that fits really well with what you were saying. Anyone else?
The quick thing I want to say,
Sure.
with especially those who are within the United States, when I hear Hussein's question, I think to myself, you know, why is it that government doesn't care about nurses? And part of the immediate follow-up question I'll ask the individual, have you contacted your member of Congress? And overwhelmingly, the answer is no. It's like, okay, if you are not contacting them, then how are they supposed to know what is going on? If you are not reaching out to them on a regular basis, then they will not know of the concerns that you have going on there. In the United States, you know, you elected them or your community elected that person. So having frequent communication, not just an annual Hill Day with whatever respective organization, those are important, but you need to be having consistent communications or being active with a organization that you trust, that is doing good work in the world of health policy, because there's a number of nursing organizations that, you know, of the half dozen or so that I've been part of, every single one has had either a government affairs committee or health policy committee, and they are always looking for individuals to be active.
So we need to invest more in our own visibility, isn't it? We need to make the most of what's out there in terms of the communication tools and the links that we have in the case of the US, for example, with the congressmen and congresswomen that represent the people who vote. So that's,
Exactly.
that's a really good example, Stephen. Anyone else? No? Okay. Well, the conversation.
I just wanted to say one key point there from
Oui,
Stephen.
moi, je voulais ajouter quelque chose.
Yves, please, let's.
Oui, moi, je voulais ajouter.
Love to hear from you.
Oui, je voulais ajouter quelque chose par rapport à cette question. Par exemple, pour nous en Haïti, dès que nous parlons de la valorisation de ces professionnels, on pourrait dire que le gouvernement même qui a créé les écoles d'infirmières ou bien les écoles de sages-femmes, même dans les documents et du gouvernement ou bien les documents du MSPP, qui est le ministère de la Santé publique à la population, n'est pas figuré le professionnel sage-femme. Et en plus, le salaire qui est attribué à ces professionnels, c'est quelque chose de misérable. Donc, on ne peut même pas survivre avec ce salaire qu'on donne aux infirmières et aux sages-femmes dans nos pays. Donc, c'est pourquoi les infirmières et les sages-femmes, elles se sacrifient jour et nuit pour prendre plusieurs boulots à la fois, pour faire les bouchées doubles. Donc, on pourrait dire qu'en gros, le gouvernement n'a pas valorisé ces professionnels dans notre pays. Et comme a dit le collègue qui vient des États-Unis, donc dans notre association, on fait de notre mieux. On a mis sur pied un comité de plaidoyer pour discuter des affaires de sages-femmes et pour aller au ministère pour que le nom des sages-femmes puisse intégrer dans les documents du ministère de la Santé publique, étant donné que nous n'avons pas de parlement là maintenant. C'est toujours des choses à faire, à recommencer, et vous savez très bien, quand c'est les hommes qui gouvernent, il y a toujours un côté patriarcal dans tout ce qu'ils font. Ce sont les médecins qui sont à la garde, et en première vue, c'est lui qui décide, c'est pas les infirmières qui sont des femmes. Donc chez nous, les infirmières et les sages-femmes, on en souffre beaucoup.
Yves, thank you very much for sharing that. What I think is a really harsh reality. You've got massive obstacles in front of you, and so I admire even most the advocacy movement that you seem to be leading, and as other guests mentioned, there are so many other dynamics related to this issue of nurses having a voice and being able to sit at the table with others. So thank you, and good luck for the amazing work that you were doing. Matt, I think you also wanted to add something to end.
I just wanted to take from both what Stephen said and Eve said and all of the fantastic presenters today, the importance of collective action. We can't do it on our own. We can do it together. If we look at disasters, however human beings ever survive any disaster, natural or otherwise, it is through working together. Nobody survives on their own. So Eve, I would hope that this network and any other contribution of any of the people involved in it would be able to support you in your collective action. And I think what Stephen was saying about, join an association, join a network, join a union, organize and advocate together. So that's the only way anybody will ever make it through any of this.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Matt. And just one final thing that I would add to that, keep in touch. Write to us. This is the beginning of, again, a conversation, of many conversations, and at least we know now that there are lots of people in various different corners of the world that are interested in this topic, and that we can come up with tangible options, opportunities for us to do something about it. So do keep in touch. I thank all the speakers for joining us today, everybody at home as well. Thank you very much for listening. And let's keep the conversation alive. So thank you so much. Don't know yet when the next webinar is going to be, the fourth webinar on the nursing and midwifery in crisis. We'll be focusing on health crisis, so relevant to what the world has been experiencing over the past 2 years, not 2 days, 2 years. And so keep an eye as well on social media, Facebook, Nursing Now, your emails if you are on Nursing Now's mailing list, so that when the date is out, you can register. Okay, so thank you very much, merci beaucoup, and I hope to see you all very soon. Take care.
Yes.
Okay, goodbye there.
Merci.
Very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Look after yourselves.